Beautifully done. It's never fair for me to follow the songs. It moves me so much. Good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation to return. My name is Claire Karl. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Movement Building Director at Unitarian Universalist Mass Action. This morning, I want to talk about the problems facing us, how solidarity for Indigenous justice is a core antidote, and some of the key ways this work is happening. Before I get into that, I have to ground into who I am in the context of this story. I am one of those descendants of settler colonists. I still am a settler colonist here on Turtle Island. And based on my research and DNA tests of my grandparents, I am 11 kinds of European. I'll name them to place myself. I am Irish, I am Welsh, I am Scottish, I am English, I am French, I am German, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and of the Balkans. Since I was a child, I've been attracted to Native American culture. I think of myself as nose pressed up against the glass of indigeneity. I was that kid at the mall who always wanted to go into the store with the dream catchers, the t-shirts with the wolves on them. And as an adult, I've come to think of that in part because I'm extremely unhappy living under colonialist racial capitalism here. I'm often lonely, I'm stressed about money, my health, my family's health, the climate, the state of our democracy, just to name a few. Perhaps you are also unhappy with these things. I'm grateful to name them in your company because it's so much easier to face that together. At UU Mass Action, we define the root of all of these problems as colonialist racial capitalism. Apologies for the jargon. So let me describe it. Colonialist racial capitalism is the dominant worldview that we live in. It is the never-ending, profit-driven extraction of wealth and exploitation of land and people. And it's made possible by anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and the erasures of Indigenous people. This exploitation of wealth, these systems of oppression, they make it okay for some people and land to be sacrificed. I remember seeing this all too clearly, especially in the early years of the pandemic, when frontline workers, medical personnel, bus drivers, grocery workers, many of whom are low income and people of color, weren't protected. Sure, I put up a lawn sign with everyone else with a heart thanking them, but that's really not the same as actual policies that would have limited exposures. Those groups of people were considered more okay to go out and be exposed. So this is the reality we live in. This is the dominant system on our planet at this time. But it's not the only one. Last year I read this book. I highly recommend it. I'll save it and share it later if you want to take a picture of the cover. It's called Restoring the Kinship Worldview. Indigenous voices introducing 28 precepts for rebalancing life on planet Earth. It's incredible. It lays it out. Restoring the kinship worldview. There are an estimated 370 million Indigenous people spread out across 70 countries worldwide. And they are by no means a monolithic group. There is lots of diversity. They're not living exactly the same. But there are common threads that this book touches upon. threads that I think make an Indigenous worldview the antidote to the current dominant worldview. One precept in particular has stuck with me ever since I read it. It's the chapter called Generosity as a Way of Life. Did you know that when Christopher Columbus arrived in the Dominican Republic, he was so confused by the generosity of the Taino peoples he encountered there and later murdered and enslaved, that he wrote back in a letter to the King of Spain, King Ferdinand. He wrote, "They're so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has witnessed it them would believe it. When you ask them for something they have, they never say no." Gives me goosebumps to picture it. This European man who traveled across an ocean to exploit and take arrives in a culture of generosity where everything that he and his men asked for, they gave. It's just heartbreaking when you think about that taking mindset meeting a group with a giving mindset. You can see where it landed. Take, 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 take. Not long after I read this chapter, I was up in New Hampshire with my partner, being a tourist in a beautiful place. We're walking along Main Street, drifting in and out of stores, getting a bite to eat. And I walk into one of these shops, and as soon as I walk in, the woman behind the cash register visibly lights up. She looks at me and goes, "Where did you get that hat? It's beautiful." And I had just recently got the hat. I was honestly very blasé about it. And so I just took it right off. And I said, "Oh my God, I want you to have this." And you should have seen the look on her face. She was like, no. I wasn't asking you for your hat. And I'm like, I know. But you so clearly love it. I want you to have it. And we did this like weird dance for like longer than I expected. It was almost heartache that it was so hard for the gift to happen. I don't know if you've had that experience before. But after I had given it to her and she had been able to accept it, there was just this beautiful feeling of warmth between us that has stuck with me. I felt like I had moved closer to who I want to be. Those of us living steeped, entrenched, marinated in this taker worldview can be unused to generosity. I've read so many accounts of this culture. There are some indigenous communities where there are rituals, where their leadership is gauged on how generous they are. There's celebrations where he, she, or they give away almost everything they have. And that's considered one of the highest displays of leadership. I like to imagine a Massachusetts entirely based on generosity. If you need affordable housing, we get it to you. If you need healthy food, we get it to you. Childcare, transportation, medical leave, disability support. You get my drift. We get it to you. What a relief that would be for me. To know that if the challenges you face or your loved ones, to know that our collective, our common wealth would be there to catch you. An actual safety net, perhaps. And I don't want to act as if none of this exists. It does. It exists right here. Think of our congregations as one of the places where generosity is still deeply cultivated and nourished. Last year, one of the board members at UMass Action broke her leg. It was extremely challenging. She lives alone now, and she had recently acquired a puppy. With a broken leg, she could hardly move herself about, let alone take care of this new young dog. But her congregation showed up. I remember reaching out to her to ask, how is it going? And she told me that literally every walk her dog needed, someone in her congregation had signed up for. She was good. What if all of Massachusetts operated that way? What if our public policy had that type of value built into it? One of our priorities right now for our immigrant justice campaign is to ensure that incarcerated people can make cost-free phone calls. Imagine trying to ensure that people who are held in our prison industrial complex could have access to stay connected to their community, to family, to legal services, and to provide that assuming the best, not the worst. What if we always assumed a generous story? A Dakota elder, Ella Deloria, is quoted in this book contrasting these two systems, and I want to read to you it now because she just does it so well. The aim of the old Dakota economic system and that of the white man's are one and the same, as incongruous as that sounds when we compare the two systems for achieving it. Security. That was the aim. Food, clothing, shelter, and an old age free from want. All peoples need it. It is what they struggle for in their respective ways. But the two systems in question are irreconcilable. They go counter to each other. One says, in effect, get now. All you can, as you can, for yourself. And so ensure security for yourself. If all will do this, then everyone will be safe. And this system depends on things, primarily. The other said, give to others. Let gifts flow freely out, and they will flow freely back to you again. In the universal and endless stream of giving, this is bound to be so. And that system is primarily dependent on human beings, friends, relatives. Given the future we face, it's easy for me to choose which system I prefer. And here in Massachusetts, we have a long way to go to have a society grounded in an Indigenous worldview. UMass Action is part of the Mass Indigenous Legislative Agenda, with leadership from the North American Indian Center of Boston, receiving your plate share today, as well as the United American Indians of New England, who are the organization that runs the National Day of Mourning. Massachusetts, in many ways, is one of the ground zeros for settler colonization in North America. The Massachusetts people, the Wampanoag people, the Nipmuc, people here have been oppressed for more than 400 years. I think about that compared to, the Zapatistas in Oaxaca, who have an autonomous zone within Mexico where they're completely living their values. I mean, my gosh, we are far from that. We have a long way to go. But as part of the Mass Indigenous Legislative Agenda, we have 5 policies that would move us closer. They're no-brainers. I'll just run through them very quickly. Number 1, replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day statewide. Right? No-brainer. Let's prohibit the use of Indigenous people as mascots. Right? No-brainer. Let's consult with Native tribes to create curriculum in our public schools that actually teaches and celebrates accurately about Indigenous people. Let's establish a commission to look into the educational outcomes of Native children in our public schools. And lastly, let's ban the selling for profit of sacred cultural objects. Very simple policies. I think about my other hat where I'm on our climate team, and those policies I can't usually explain in one sentence. These are not revolutionary, but they are necessary. They are critical stepping stones in Massachusetts towards an Indigenous worldview, just like a land acknowledgement is a first step. We acknowledge that the land was stolen. Now what? Now we work towards bringing it back to an Indigenous stewardship, moving forwards together towards a generous future. I want to begin to land this talk by reminding us of all of our stake in this work. That dominant worldview is destructive, it's harmful, and no one is doing well. As I mentioned before, while I am enormously grateful, I have joy, I have abundance in my life, I'm also deeply unhappy. And I invite you to sometimes tap into that if you don't already. Tap into the ways that you are deeply unhappy under this status quo. To think about the ways in which this scarcity system also stresses you, perhaps about money, housing, healthcare. The prospect of raising children where there are many adults around who are confused about gender, about sexual orientation, about consent. It is a wonderful time to be alive, but it is also sometimes a scary one. When we work towards an Indigenous worldview, we work towards a generous future. And that's just one of the 28 chapters in this book. There's also going to be connection to land, to ancestors, delight, and full support for young people, as well as elders. There's going to be rest. There's going to be humor, interdependence, emphasis on truthfulness and gratitude. I want the whole thing. That's the vision that keeps me going. Trying to run around, clean up the mess of climate change, clean up the mess of our democracy, that part's important, but it's also exhausting. Having this vision of a life-giving world, that's what keeps me going. And I want to be clear, when I talk about moving towards an Indigenous worldview, I don't mean going backwards to some version of what the Pennacook were doing on this land in the 1400s. That's not what I mean. We're still going to have internet and showers. But I mean arranging our civilization around kinship, around love and connection. And I think most of us, most of our movement is already engaged in this work, but maybe not seeing it or naming it as part of this paradigm shift to an Indigenous worldview. And I think it's critical that I name it in that way. Because it's not just a little tweak here or like a shift there. It's an entire worldview. And I'm very hopeful that we can do it. This past summer, I went to Germany, where 20 of my 32 great-great-great-grandparents were born. I went looking for roots, and I did find roots, but I did not find indigeneity. I was reminded that Europe was colonized first, colonized itself. And I found myself ironically grateful to be born in the US, to be in a place where there is Indigenous leadership right up next to me at these amazing organizations at the State House. I thought to myself, we could really make some big leaps because we have that vision closer. So I hope you'll join me in cultivating this vision. To join with UMass Action, I have brought interest cards with me again today, as I have the last couple times. You're always welcome to fill one out. And as mentioned, I'll be after the service for Justice Soup. We'll be talking specifically about Indigenous Peoples Day and the legislative agenda. Thank you all so much for sharing this space together.